Sarah Mitchell was one of only 3 patients who ever escaped the Whitmore sisters' sanitarium alive. For 14 months, she never swallowed the medicine they gave her each night. Instead, she hid the pills under her tongue and watched what happened to the others. What she witnessed would expose a horror that the Catholic Church tried to bury for 80 years. 2 nuns stood accused of murdering 120 patients. But the word cannibalism never appeared in the charges, because Victorian society wasn't ready to hear that word spoken about women of God. Before we descend into the nightmare that was the Whitmore Sisters Sanitarium, I need to ask something of you. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the darkest secrets hidden in America's medical history. If you're one of the few who can handle these revelations, hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment telling me what state you're listening from, because the horrors we uncover happened in communities just like yours. Your support helps us bring these buried truths into the light. Now let's journey back to 1885 Vermont, where 2 sisters built an empire of suffering disguised as salvation. The state of Vermont in 1885 was a land of harsh winters and even harsher attitudes toward mental illness. In an era when psychology was barely recognized as a legitimate field of medicine, those suffering from depression, anxiety, hysteria, or any condition that deviated from strict social norms faced a terrifying reality. They could be committed to institutions against their will, stripped of all legal rights, and subjected to treatments that ranged from useless to outright torture. Families with means sent their troubled relatives to private facilities that promised discreet, compassionate care. Those without money faced the nightmare of state asylums where patients were warehoused in conditions little better than prisons. It was into this landscape of desperation and stigma that Sister Catherine and Sister Margaret Whitmore arrived in the small town of Millbrook, Vermont, in early 1885. The twin sisters, both 42 years old, came with impeccable credentials from the Catholic Church. They had served for 20 years in various church hospitals and charitable institutions across New England, building reputations as skilled nurses with particular expertise in caring for patients with nervous disorders and mental afflictions. Letters of recommendation from bishops and mother superiors praised their dedication, their medical knowledge, and most importantly, their deep Christian compassion for suffering souls. The Whitmore twins were identical in appearance, a fact that would later prove significant in ways no one initially suspected. Both stood precisely 5 feet 6 inches tall, with severe features softened only slightly by their habits. Their gray eyes held an intensity that some found comforting and others found unsettling. They moved with synchronized precision, often completing each other's sentences and seeming to communicate through glances that required no words. Their identical nature extended beyond mere physical appearance to encompass mannerisms, speech patterns, and what witnesses later described as an almost supernatural connection that allowed them to work together with unnerving efficiency. The sanitarium they established occupied a large Victorian mansion on the outskirts of Millbrook, a 3-story structure that had once belonged to a lumber baron who had died, leaving no heirs. The sisters purchased the property with funds provided by the Catholic diocese, which saw the establishment of a private mental health facility as both a charitable mission and a potentially profitable venture. The location was ideal for their stated purposes, remote enough to provide privacy for wealthy families who wished to keep their relatives' conditions secret, yet close enough to town to maintain appearances of legitimacy and access to supplies. The sisters spent the first 3 months of 1885 converting the mansion into what appeared to be a model medical facility. They installed individual patient rooms on the 2nd and 3rd floors, each equipped with a bed, a small desk, and barred windows that they explained were necessary to prevent patients from harming themselves during episodes of confusion or distress. The first floor contained a receiving area, consultation rooms, a dining hall, and offices for the sisters. But it was the basement that received their most careful attention, a fact that would prove grimly significant years later. The basement level was divided into multiple chambers that the sisters described as treatment rooms, storage areas, and a small chapel where patients could seek spiritual comfort. Access to the basement was strictly controlled, with only the Whitmore twins possessing keys to the heavy oak door at the top of the stairs. When questioned about this unusual security measure, the sisters explained that they stored medications and medical equipment that could be dangerous if accessed by confused or suicidal patients. This explanation satisfied the few local officials who bothered to inspect the facility before granting the required permits for operation. The Whitmore Sisters Sanitarium officially opened for patients on June 1, 1885, with considerable fanfare in the local and regional press. Newspapers praised the establishment as a progressive facility that would provide humane, modern treatment for mental and nervous disorders in a Christian environment. The sisters gave carefully staged tours to local dignitaries and potential referring physicians, showcasing spotless patient rooms, a well-stocked library, and gardens where patients could take therapeutic walks. Everything appeared precisely as a respectable medical facility should appear. The first patients arrived within days of opening, referred by physicians from Burlington, Montpelier, and even as far away as Boston. Wealthy families grateful for a discreet option to house relatives suffering from melancholia, nervous exhaustion, hysteria, or the vague diagnosis of brain fever that covered a multitude of conditions. The Whitmore sisters accepted patients selectively, preferring those whose families lived at considerable distance and who suffered from conditions severe enough to justify long-term confinement. They charged substantial fees, explaining that quality care required significant resources, and families desperate to hide away troublesome relatives rarely questioned the costs. The treatment protocol at the sanitarium followed what the Whitmore sisters described as a holistic approach, combining rest, nutrition, spiritual counseling, and carefully calibrated medications. Patients spent their days in structured routines of meals, supervised exercise, and therapeutic activities. The sisters conducted daily examinations, maintained detailed medical records, and wrote regular reports to families assuring them of steady progress toward recovery. Everything appeared entirely proper and professional to outside observers who had no reason to suspect anything wrong. But beneath this carefully maintained facade, something far darker was unfolding. The sisters had developed what they called their research program, a systematic study of mental illness that they claimed would advance medical understanding and lead to better treatments. They kept meticulous notebooks documenting each patient's symptoms, behavior patterns, and responses to various interventions. But these clinical observations gradually took on a more sinister character as the sisters' curiosity evolved into obsession, and their obsession evolved into something that defied rational explanation. Sister Catherine, who handled most of the medical procedures, had developed theories about the physical basis of mental illness that were far ahead of their time in some ways and horrifyingly primitive in others. She believed that examining the brains and organs of mental patients after death could reveal structural abnormalities that explained their conditions. This wasn't entirely unreasonable given the limited understanding of neuroscience in 1885, but Catherine's interests extended beyond legitimate medical research into territories that suggested deep psychological disturbance masked by professional credentials and religious authority. Sister Margaret, who managed the administrative and financial aspects of the sanitarium, proved equally disturbing in her methodical approach to selecting and processing patients. She maintained detailed records of each patient's family situation, financial resources, and likelihood of being visited or closely monitored. She identified patients whose prolonged absence would attract minimal attention, those whose families were grateful to have them hidden away and unlikely to ask difficult questions. Together, the twins created a system that allowed them to operate with minimal oversight while maintaining an impeccable public reputation. The medication regimen at the sanitarium deserves particular scrutiny, as it became the primary tool for controlling patients and concealing what was actually happening. The sisters prepared all medications themselves, mixing compounds from raw ingredients in the basement pharmacy that they kept locked and off-limits to everyone else. They told patients and any visiting family members that the medicines were specialized formulations based on advanced European psychiatric research. In reality, the evening doses contained powerful sedatives that rendered patients unconscious for hours, allowing the sisters to conduct their activities without witnesses or resistance. Sarah Mitchell arrived at the Whitmore Sisters Sanitarium on April 12, 1887, brought by her desperate husband, who had been advised by their family physician that Sarah's severe melancholia required professional institutional care. At just 24 years old, Sarah had been suffering from deep depression following the stillbirth of her first child. She spent weeks unable to eat, sleep, or take interest in life, expressing wishes that she had died instead of her baby. Her husband, a prosperous merchant from Burlington, spared no expense in seeking the best care available, and the Whitmore facility came with the highest recommendations. Sarah's first impressions of the sanitarium were mixed. The building itself was imposing and cold, despite the sisters' attempts to make it welcoming. The other patients she glimpsed during her initial tour seemed oddly subdued, moving through their routines with mechanical precision, but little spark of genuine emotion or personality. The Whitmore twins themselves projected an unsettling combination of professional competence and something Sarah couldn't quite identify, an intensity in their gray eyes that seemed to study her not with compassion, but with the calculating interest of a naturalist examining an interesting specimen. The daily routine at the sanitarium was rigid and unchanging. Patients rose at 6, washed and dressed under the supervision of the attendants the sisters employed, then gathered for breakfast in the common dining room. Meals were adequate but institutional, designed for nutrition rather than pleasure. After breakfast came morning exercise, either walks in the garden during good weather or calisthenics in the main hall during Vermont's long winter months. Mid-morning brought individual consultations with Sister Catherine, who conducted brief examinations and adjusted medication dosages. Lunch was followed by rest period, then afternoon activities that included reading, needlework for female patients, or simple crafts. But it was the evening routine that revealed the sanitarium's true nature to those perceptive enough to notice. After dinner, patients were given their evening medication, small white pills that Sister Margaret personally distributed with glasses of water. She watched carefully to ensure each patient swallowed their dose, checking mouths and under tongues for anyone attempting to hide pills. Within 30 minutes, patients began showing signs of drowsiness, and within an hour, most were unconscious in their beds. The sisters explained this as the natural result of therapeutic rest, essential for healing troubled minds. Sarah Mitchell discovered the truth about those pills entirely by accident during her first week at the sanitarium. She had developed a trick during her years of marriage for avoiding medications that upset her stomach, holding pills under her tongue until she could discreetly spit them out later. On her third night, she employed this technique without really thinking about it, more from habit than any particular suspicion. The pill Sister Margaret gave her tasted bitter and slightly chalky, and Sarah tucked it carefully under her tongue while swallowing the water and opening her mouth for inspection. That night, while her fellow patients descended into drugged unconsciousness, Sarah remained awake in her small room on the third floor. She heard the sisters' footsteps in the hallway around midnight, moving from room to room with quiet efficiency. She heard doors opening and closing, the squeak of bed frames, and occasionally soft sounds that might have been voices or might have been something else. Curiosity overcoming caution, Sarah crept to her door and peered through the small glass panel that allowed staff to observe patients without entering rooms. What she saw in the dim hallway lamplight made her blood run cold. Sister Catherine and Sister Margaret were moving a patient, a middle-aged woman named Elizabeth Winters, from her room toward the stairs. Elizabeth wasn't walking but being carried, completely limp and unconscious. The sisters handled her with practiced efficiency, supporting her weight between them as they navigated toward the staircase that led down to the ground floor. Sarah watched them disappear around the corner, then waited in tense silence for over an hour until she heard their footsteps returning. They were empty-handed now, moving back to their own quarters with the same quiet efficiency. The next morning at breakfast, Elizabeth Winters' chair sat empty. When Sarah quietly asked another patient about Elizabeth's absence, the response was matter-of-fact and chilling. "Oh, she died during the night. It happens sometimes. The sisters say it's because their conditions were too severe. At least she's at peace now." The casual acceptance of death, the complete lack of surprise or grief, told Sarah that this was not an unusual occurrence. Patients disappeared with disturbing regularity, and those who remained had been so thoroughly sedated and conditioned that they accepted these deaths as natural and inevitable. Sarah Mitchell made a decision that night that would ultimately save her life and expose the Whitmore twins' crimes. She would continue to hide her evening medication and observe what happened during those late-night hours when the rest of the facility slept. She would document everything she saw and find a way to get that information to authorities who might actually investigate. It was a dangerous decision, one that put her at tremendous risk, but Sarah's depression had given way to a fierce survival instinct and a determination that justice be served for whatever was happening in this place, masquerading as a house of healing. Over the following months, Sarah became an expert at deception. She perfected her technique for hiding the evening pills, sometimes palming them and dropping them into her chamber pot later, other times wedging them into cracks in the wooden floor beneath her bed. She learned to feign the signs of sedation, lying still and breathing deeply when the sisters made their late-night rounds checking on patients. And most importantly, she watched and remembered everything, creating a mental catalogue of patients who disappeared and the timing of their vanishing. Sarah Mitchell spent the next 8 months living a double life. By day, she played the role of the compliant, sedated patient slowly recovering from her melancholia. By night, she remained vigilant and aware, documenting in her mind every detail of the sanitarium's dark operations. What she discovered during those months would challenge everything Victorian society believed about the sanctity of medical institutions and the trustworthiness of religious authority. The pattern became clear after just 3 weeks of observation. Every 7 to 10 days, the Whitmore twins would select a patient for their midnight procedures. The selection process followed a disturbing logic that Sarah gradually decoded. They chose patients whose families visited infrequently or not at all. They preferred those who had been at the sanitarium for at least 3 months, long enough for families to accept the likelihood of a tragic outcome. And most tellingly, they selected patients who showed signs of physical decline or deterioration that could plausibly explain a natural death. The midnight removals always followed the same ritual. Around 11:30, Sarah would hear the sisters' synchronized footsteps climbing to the upper floors. They moved from room to room, checking on patients with practiced efficiency. Then around midnight, they would enter a specific patient's room and emerge minutes later carrying an unconscious body between them. They navigated the stairs with remarkable coordination, moving as a single organism rather than two separate individuals. They always descended to the basement level, and they always returned empty-handed between 2 and 4 hours later. The morning after these midnight removals, the sanitarium staff would discover that another patient had passed away peacefully during the night. Sister Catherine would announce the death at breakfast with appropriate solemnity, explaining that the patient's condition had proven too severe for even the most advanced treatments. She would cite medical terms that sounded authoritative but were deliberately vague: brain inflammation, nervous exhaustion of vital organs, or cardiac failure resulting from prolonged melancholia. Families would be notified by telegram, and bodies would be prepared for burial in the sanitarium's small private cemetery before relatives could arrive to view them. But Sarah noticed something that apparently no one else had questioned. The bodies prepared for burial never quite matched the patients who had disappeared. The deceased always looked gaunt and wasted, as though they had died after prolonged illness, even when the patient had appeared relatively healthy just days before. More disturbing still, the bodies were always prepared with closed coffins, with the sisters explaining that the ravages of mental illness made open casket viewings inadvisable for the family's emotional well-being. In an era when people generally accepted medical authority without question, these explanations were rarely challenged. Sarah's most significant discovery came on a humid night in late July 1887. She had been at the sanitarium for 3 months, long enough to be considered a stable, improving patient who posed no flight risk. The sisters had grown comfortable with her apparent compliance and no longer checked on her as frequently during their midnight rounds. On this particular night, Sarah heard the familiar sounds of a patient being removed from a room 2 doors down from hers, a young woman named Margaret Fuller, who had been committed by her family for hysteria. After waiting for the sisters to descend to the basement level, Sarah made a decision that could have cost her life. She quietly opened her door and slipped into the hallway, moving barefoot across cold wooden floors toward the main staircase. The building was old and creaky, and every footstep risked alerting the twins to her presence. But Sarah had spent months learning which floorboards squeaked and which provided silent passage. She made it to the top of the basement stairs without incident. The heavy oak door stood slightly ajar, something Sarah had never witnessed before. Perhaps in their confidence and routine, the sisters had grown careless. Perhaps it was simple human error after years of flawless execution. Whatever the reason, Sarah saw her opportunity and took it. She descended the basement stairs one careful step at a time, pressing against the wall to minimize the sound of her movement. The darkness was nearly complete, broken only by lamplight filtering from somewhere deeper in the basement level. What Sarah saw when she reached the bottom of those stairs would haunt her for the remaining 43 years of her life. The basement had been converted into a fully equipped medical theater that would have been impressive in any major hospital. Surgical tables, glass-fronted cabinets filled with instruments, shelves lined with specimen jars, and most horrifying of all, the Whitmore twins working with the focused intensity of surgeons, performing a delicate operation. Margaret Fuller lay unconscious on the central table, her body already opened by precise incisions that revealed her internal organs to the lamplight. Sister Catherine stood at the table with a scalpel in her gloved hands, carefully removing what appeared to be Margaret's liver, while Sister Margaret recorded observations in a leather-bound notebook. Their conversation was clinical and detached, discussing the organ's color, texture, and apparent health with the dispassion of scientists conducting research rather than monsters committing murder. But it was what Sarah saw on the shelves behind them that turned her blood to ice and nearly caused her to cry out in horror. Dozens of glass jars lined the shelves, each containing preserved organs suspended in clear liquid. Each jar bore a carefully written label with a name, a date, and clinical observations. Sarah recognized some of the names from patients who had died during her time at the sanitarium, but many more dated back to the facility's opening in 1885, representing 2 years of systematic murder disguised as medical research. The scope of the horror was staggering, and the meticulous organization of it all suggested minds that had completely divorced their actions from any moral framework. But Sarah noticed something else that transformed her horror into a different kind of dread. On a separate table near the back of the room sat plates with what appeared to be prepared food, cooked meat, carefully arranged and garnished, as though the sisters intended to dine after completing their procedures. The implications of those plates, combined with everything else Sarah had witnessed, created a picture so disturbing that she struggled to process it. The Whitmore twins weren't just studying their victims, they were consuming them. Sarah managed to retreat back up the stairs without being discovered, though her hands shook so badly she could barely turn the doorknob. She returned to her room and spent the remainder of the night staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through the implications of what she had witnessed. She now understood why patients who died at the sanitarium looked so wasted and thin. The sisters were systematically harvesting organs and tissue, reducing bodies to shells before preparing them for burial. And they were doing it all under the protection of religious authority and medical credentials that made them virtually immune to suspicion. The next morning, Margaret Fuller's death was announced at breakfast with the usual somber efficiency. Sister Catherine explained that Margaret had succumbed during the night to acute brain inflammation that had progressed too rapidly for intervention. The remaining patients accepted this explanation with the same drugged passivity they showed toward everything else. Only Sarah knew the truth, and the knowledge weighed on her like a physical burden. She was trapped in a house of horrors, with no clear path to escape, and no certainty that anyone would believe her even if she managed to get word to authorities. Sarah's situation grew more precarious as the months progressed. She had now been at the sanitarium for nearly 6 months, long enough that the Whitmore twins might soon consider her a suitable candidate for their research. She noticed them paying more attention to her during examinations, discussing her case in whispered conferences that ended when she drew near. She overheard Sister Margaret reviewing her file and commenting that her family hadn't visited in 2 months and had written only twice. Sarah realized with growing dread that she was being evaluated according to the same criteria that had doomed so many others. The breaking point came in early November 1887. A new patient arrived at the sanitarium, a young man named Thomas Brennan, who had been committed by his family for what they described as religious mania. Thomas was actually quite lucid and articulate, his only crime being that he had questioned certain church doctrines and considered leaving the Catholic faith. His wealthy family, horrified by this apostasy, had used commitment to a church-run institution as a way to force his return to orthodoxy. Thomas arrived angry and defiant, refusing to take medications and demanding to speak with legal authorities. Sarah recognized immediately that Thomas represented both an opportunity and a terrible danger. He was alert, intelligent, and deeply suspicious of the Whitmore twins from his first day at the sanitarium. If she could ally with him, they might find a way to escape together and expose what was happening. But his refusal to take medications and his vocal complaints also made him a prime target for the sisters' midnight procedures. Sarah had to act quickly if she wanted to save both Thomas and herself. She managed to speak with Thomas privately in the garden during afternoon exercise period. Speaking in whispers while appearing to make casual conversation, she told him a carefully edited version of what she had discovered. She explained about the medication that kept patients unconscious, about the midnight removals, and about the suspicious frequency of deaths at the facility. She didn't yet reveal the full horror of what she had seen in the basement, fearing that the complete truth might be too much for Thomas to accept, or might cause him to react in ways that would alert the sisters to danger. Thomas believed her immediately, his suspicions about the sanitarium confirmed by Sarah's testimony. Together they began planning an escape, but they faced significant obstacles. The sanitarium was isolated, located miles from the nearest town, with no easy access to transportation. The building itself was secured at night with locked doors and barred windows. And most critically, any escape attempt would have to occur during the hours when the staff was minimal, which coincided with the times when the Whitmore twins were most active and alert. Their opportunity came sooner than expected, but under the worst possible circumstances. On November 18, 1887, Sister Margaret announced at breakfast that Thomas Brennan's condition had deteriorated overnight and that he required intensive treatment in isolation. Thomas was removed to a single room on the third floor, separated from other patients and under constant supervision. Sarah recognized this as the pattern that preceded midnight procedures. Thomas had been at the sanitarium for less than 2 weeks, suggesting that the sisters viewed him as a threat that needed to be eliminated quickly before he could cause problems. That night, Sarah made her decision. She would attempt to free Thomas and escape with him, even knowing that failure would almost certainly result in both their deaths. She waited until she heard the familiar sounds of the sisters' midnight rounds, then carefully worked to remove the bars from her window using a metal file she had stolen from the art therapy supplies weeks earlier. The bars had been corroded by years of Vermont weather, and after months of secret work, Sarah had weakened them to the point where they could be pried loose with sufficient force. The window removal took nearly 30 minutes of agonizing effort, with every scrape of metal against metal threatening to alert someone to her activities. But finally, the bars came free, and Sarah squeezed through the narrow opening onto a small ledge outside her third-floor window. The drop to the ground was at least 30 feet, far too high to jump safely. But a sturdy ivy vine grew up the side of the building, and Sarah trusted her weight to it while climbing down in the darkness. She made it to the ground with only minor scrapes, and immediately moved to position herself beneath Thomas's window. She gathered small pebbles and began tossing them against his glass, praying he was awake and alert enough to hear. After several agonizing minutes, Thomas's face appeared at the window. Sarah gestured frantically for him to escape using the same method she had employed. Thomas nodded understanding and disappeared from view. But then Sarah heard sounds that made her heart sink. Voices from inside the building, the Whitmore twins moving earlier than usual, footsteps climbing rapidly toward the third floor. They had discovered something was wrong, perhaps had found Sarah's empty room during their rounds, perhaps had heard the sounds of Thomas working to loosen his window bars. Whatever had alerted them, the sisters were now hunting for their escaped patients with urgent intensity. Thomas appeared at his window, having successfully removed the bars, but hesitated at the dangerous climb down. Sarah could hear doors slamming inside the building, and voices calling out in alarm. She screamed up at Thomas to hurry, her voice breaking the nighttime silence and eliminating any chance of stealth. Thomas committed to the climb, trusting his weight to the ivy and descending as quickly as he dared. He was halfway down when lamplight appeared in windows throughout the building, and Sarah heard the back door being unlocked. Thomas dropped the final 10 feet, landing hard but managing to stay on his feet. Sarah grabbed his arm, and together they ran toward the woods that bordered the sanitarium property. Behind them they heard the Whitmore twins emerging from the building, their voices calling out commands to the nighttime staff. Lamps were being lit throughout the grounds, and Sarah knew they had only minutes before an organized search would begin. Their only advantage was darkness and their knowledge of the general direction toward town. They ran through the Vermont forest with desperate energy, branches tearing at their clothes and faces, the cold November air burning their lungs. Sarah had no shoes, having left them behind in her escape, and her feet were soon bleeding from cuts and scrapes. Thomas supported her when she stumbled, and she urged him forward when his resolve wavered. Behind them they could hear voices and see occasional glimmers of lamplight as their pursuers began to organize a search. The flight through the forest lasted nearly 2 hours before Sarah and Thomas finally emerged onto a road they recognized as the main route between Millbrook and the neighboring town of Greenfield. They were exhausted, injured, and disoriented, but they were free. As dawn began to break, they flagged down a farmer's wagon and convinced the startled driver to take them immediately to the county sheriff's office in Greenfield. They insisted on speaking only to the sheriff himself, refusing to explain their situation to anyone else for fear that the Whitmore twins' influence and religious authority might compromise local officials. Sheriff Robert Harrison of Greenfield County was a practical man who had seen much during his 30 years in law enforcement, but nothing had prepared him for the story that Sarah Mitchell and Thomas Brennan told him on that cold November morning in 1887. Two bedraggled escapees from a respected Catholic sanitarium, claiming that twin nuns were systematically murdering patients and harvesting their organs. It sounded like the ravings of genuinely disturbed individuals, exactly the kind of paranoid delusions that might justify their commitment to a mental institution in the first place. But something in Sarah's eyes gave Harrison pause. She wasn't hysterical or incoherent. She spoke with the calm precision of someone recounting facts rather than fantasies. She provided specific names, dates, and details that could be verified. Most compelling of all, she described the layout of the sanitarium's basement with such precise detail that Harrison found it difficult to believe she could have invented it all. And Thomas Brennan, despite his obvious exhaustion and fear, corroborated every element of Sarah's testimony and added observations of his own about the suspicious operations at the facility. Harrison faced a delicate situation that required careful navigation. The Whitmore sisters' sanitarium enjoyed an impeccable reputation and the explicit endorsement of the Catholic diocese. The twins themselves were respected medical professionals whose word would carry considerable weight against accusations from two mental patients. If Harrison acted rashly based on unsubstantiated claims and found nothing, he would face professional destruction and likely legal action. But if Sarah and Thomas were telling the truth and he failed to act, more people would die. The sheriff made his decision. He would conduct a surprise inspection of the sanitarium immediately, before the Whitmore twins had time to destroy evidence or prepare elaborate explanations. He assembled a team of 6 deputies, the county coroner, and critically, a representative from the state medical board who happened to be visiting Greenfield on unrelated business. This combination of law enforcement and medical authority would provide the credibility necessary to challenge the twins' professional standing and religious protection. The raid on the Whitmore sisters' sanitarium began at 10 o'clock on the morning of November 19, 1887. Sheriff Harrison and his team arrived without warning, presenting a warrant that gave them authority to search the entire facility and interview any patients or staff. The Whitmore twins greeted them with cool composure that bordered on arrogance, expressing surprise at the visit, but readily agreeing to cooperate with what they assumed would be a routine inspection that would vindicate them completely. Sister Catherine led the inspection tour personally, showing the officials through the patient rooms, the dining facilities, and the treatment areas on the main floors. Everything appeared exactly as it should in a well-run medical facility. Patient rooms were clean and adequately furnished. The dining hall was hygienic and properly equipped. Medical supplies were organized and properly stored. The patients themselves, those who were awake and coherent enough to speak, offered no complaints about their treatment. Harrison began to worry that Sarah Mitchell's testimony might indeed be the product of delusion rather than observation. But then Harrison insisted on inspecting the basement level, the area that Sarah had described in such disturbing detail. The Whitmore twins' composure cracked slightly at this request. Sister Margaret claimed that the basement contained only storage areas and a small chapel, nothing of interest to the inspection. Sister Catherine added that some patients found the basement disturbing and they preferred to keep it locked to prevent anyone from wandering down and becoming frightened. Their resistance to this particular request confirmed Harrison's suspicion that the basement held secrets the twins desperately wanted to protect. Harrison insisted, and the twins had no legal grounds to refuse. Sister Catherine retrieved the key from her office with obvious reluctance and led the inspection team down the basement stairs. The smell hit them first, a mixture of chemicals, decay, and something else that the coroner later identified as formaldehyde mixed with other preservatives. It was the smell of a medical facility, but also something darker and more disturbing. The initial basement area appeared unremarkable, containing stored furniture, supplies, and the small chapel the sisters had mentioned. But Harrison noticed something that Sarah had specifically described in her testimony. A second door, partially concealed behind stacked crates, that led to another section of the basement. When questioned about this door, Sister Catherine claimed it led only to old coal storage areas that hadn't been used since the building was converted. But her obvious discomfort and her sister's growing agitation told Harrison he had found what he was looking for. The deputies moved the crates aside and forced the door open despite the Whitmore twins' increasingly desperate protests. What they found in that hidden chamber would become evidence in one of the most sensational trials in Vermont history, and would expose horrors that challenged every assumption about the sanctity of medical and religious authority. The basement chamber had indeed been converted into a fully equipped surgical theater, exactly as Sarah had described. Surgical tables with leather restraints still stained with blood. Glass-fronted cabinets filled with medical instruments that ranged from legitimate surgical tools to implements whose purposes were unclear, but whose presence suggested experimentation rather than healing. And most damning of all, the shelves of specimen jars that lined the walls, each containing preserved organs and tissue samples, each labeled with names and dates that corresponded to patients who had officially died from natural causes. The coroner began examining the jars with growing horror, recognizing immediately that these were not specimens from routine autopsies, but evidence of systematic organ harvesting from living or recently deceased victims. The State Medical Board representative documented the scene with meticulous detail, understanding that the evidence they were gathering would need to withstand the most vigorous legal challenges. And Harrison ordered his deputies to arrest Sister Catherine and Sister Margaret Whitmore on preliminary charges of murder and desecration of human remains. The twins' reactions to their arrest revealed much about their psychological states. Sister Catherine maintained an attitude of cold defiance, insisting that she had been conducting legitimate medical research that would someday be recognized as groundbreaking. She showed no remorse for the deaths she had caused, instead expressing frustration that ignorant authorities couldn't understand the importance of her work. Sister Margaret adopted a different strategy, claiming that she had merely been following her sister's instructions and had never fully understood the implications of what they were doing. But her own meticulous record-keeping would later prove that she had been an enthusiastic and calculating participant in every aspect of the operation. The investigation that followed the arrests uncovered evidence that exceeded even Sarah Mitchell's horrifying testimony. The Whitmore twins had maintained detailed records of every patient they had killed, creating a documentary trail that read like a catalogue of atrocity. Between June 1885 and November 1887, they had murdered at least 120 patients through a combination of deliberate overdoses, organ harvesting while victims were still alive, and in some cases direct violence when patients resisted or threatened to expose them. But the records also revealed something even more disturbing that confirmed Sarah's worst suspicions about those plates of prepared food she had seen in the basement. The Whitmore twins hadn't just been studying their victims' organs, they had been consuming human tissue as part of what Sister Catherine's notes described as research into the biological basis of mental illness. The twins believed, with a logic so twisted it defied rational comprehension, that consuming the organs of mentally ill patients would allow them to understand the physical manifestations of psychological disorders. The exhumation of bodies from the sanitarium's private cemetery provided physical evidence that corroborated the documentary records. Of the 120 patients officially buried on the grounds, forensic examination revealed that most bodies had been extensively mutilated post-mortem, with major organs removed and skeletal structures showing signs of systematic dissection. Some graves contained bodies that didn't match the identities on the grave markers, suggesting that the twins had been mixing remains to conceal the extent of their organ harvesting. And several graves contained no bodies at all, only weighted coffins filled with stones and dirt. The trial of Sister Catherine and Sister Margaret Whitmore began in May 1888 and lasted for 6 weeks. It became a national sensation, with newspapers from across America sending reporters to cover every detail of what was being called the twin nuns murder case. The prosecution built an overwhelming case combining Sarah Mitchell's eyewitness testimony, Thomas Brennan's corroborating observations, the physical evidence from the basement chamber, the documentary evidence from the twins' own records, and the forensic evidence from exhumed bodies. Sarah's testimony proved to be the emotional centerpiece of the trial. She spent 3 days on the witness stand, describing in calm, precise detail everything she had witnessed during her 14 months at the sanitarium. She explained how she had hidden her medication and remained alert during the midnight hours when other patients were unconscious. She recounted the night she had seen Elizabeth Winters carried to the basement and the morning Elizabeth was reported dead. And most powerfully, she described descending to the basement chamber and witnessing the Whitmore twins conducting their horrific procedures on Margaret Fuller. The defense attorneys attempted to discredit Sarah by emphasizing her history of mental illness and suggesting that her testimony was the product of delusions or hallucinations. But Sarah remained unshakable under cross-examination, answering every question with specific details that could be verified through other evidence. When the defense attorney suggested she had invented the story out of spite or confusion, Sarah calmly asked why she would invent details about the basement layout that proved to be exactly accurate when authorities finally inspected it. The Whitmore twins themselves never testified, invoking their right to remain silent throughout the proceedings. But Sister Catherine's detailed journals were entered as evidence, and their contents revealed the full scope of the twins' systematic approach to murder and experimentation. The journals documented not just medical observations but also the twins' evolving methodology for selecting victims, their techniques for avoiding detection, and their twisted philosophical justifications for treating human beings as research subjects. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Sister Catherine and Sister Margaret Whitmore were convicted of 120 counts of first-degree murder, making them among the most prolific serial killers in American history. The sentencing hearing became another moment of national attention as Judge William Pemberton delivered a condemnation that went beyond legal judgment to address the moral catastrophe the case represented. Judge Pemberton spoke about the sacred trust society places in medical professionals and religious figures, and how the Whitmore twins had violated that trust in the most horrific way imaginable. He noted that their crimes were made possible not by force or deception alone, but by the protective shield of respectability that their credentials and religious habits provided. He observed that the twins had shown no remorse whatsoever, instead maintaining even in their silence an attitude of superiority and self-justification that demonstrated they remained dangerous to society. Both sisters were sentenced to death by hanging, making them two of the few women in American history to receive capital punishment for serial murder. The sentences sparked considerable debate about whether executing women, particularly nuns, was appropriate regardless of their crimes. But public opinion, inflamed by the horrific details emerging from the trial, overwhelmingly supported the death sentences as the only appropriate response to such monstrous acts. The executions were carried out on November 3, 1888, nearly 1 year after Sarah Mitchell's escape had exposed the sanitarium's horrors. Both sisters went to their deaths maintaining their conviction that history would eventually vindicate their research and recognize them as pioneers rather than monsters. Sister Catherine's final words before the hood was placed over her head were reported as, "Someday science will understand what we discovered, even if this ignorant age condemns it." The twins were hanged simultaneously on adjacent gallows, dying within seconds of each other just as they had lived and killed in perfect synchronization. The Catholic Church faced its own reckoning in the aftermath of the trial. The diocese that had funded and endorsed the Whitmore sisters' sanitarium came under intense scrutiny for failing to properly oversee the facility or investigate earlier concerns about the high patient mortality rate. Internal church documents revealed that at least 2 priests had raised questions about the sanitarium's operations in 1886, but their concerns had been dismissed by superiors who trusted the Whitmore twins' medical expertise and religious credentials. The scandal forced the Church to implement new oversight procedures for all Catholic-run medical facilities and to conduct comprehensive reviews of patient care standards across their institutional network. But the damage to the Church's reputation was severe and lasting. The Whitmore case became a permanent stain on Catholic medical services and contributed to growing public skepticism about giving religious institutions unsupervised authority over vulnerable populations. For Sarah Mitchell, the trial's conclusion brought neither peace nor closure. She had done the right thing, the heroic thing, in exposing the Whitmore twins and potentially saving countless future victims. But the psychological cost of her 14 months at the sanitarium and her role in bringing the sisters to justice would haunt her for the rest of her life. She suffered from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares and flashbacks that never fully subsided. Sarah returned to her husband in Burlington, and together they tried to rebuild a normal life. She never recovered from her depression completely, but she found purpose in advocating for better oversight of mental health facilities and for legal protections for institutionalized patients. She gave lectures about her experiences, despite the personal pain it caused, believing that bearing witness to horror was a moral obligation for those who survived it. She lived until 1930, dying at age 67, having spent 4 decades ensuring that the Whitmore twins' victims were remembered and that their deaths were not in vain. Thomas Brennan faced his own challenges after the trial. His family never forgave him for the embarrassment of having their attempt to institutionalize him exposed in such a public way. He was effectively disowned and had to build a new life without family support or connections. But he found success as a journalist, using his experience at the sanitarium to fuel investigative reporting on institutional abuses and social injustices. His partnership with Sarah in advocating for reform helped change laws governing mental health facilities across multiple states. The Whitmore sisters' sanitarium building itself was burned to the ground by local residents within weeks of the executions, a symbolic purging of evil that the community needed to begin healing. The land remained empty for decades, considered cursed by locals who reported strange occurrences and unsettling sensations when near the property. It wasn't until the 1950s that the site was finally redeveloped, and even then, construction workers reported unusual difficulties, and several refused to work on the project after learning its history. The case of the Whitmore twins stands as one of the most disturbing examples of how trusted authority figures can commit atrocities under the protection of professional credentials and religious respectability. It reveals how isolation, vulnerability, and society's tendency to defer to expertise can create conditions where systematic horror can continue for years without detection. And it demonstrates the critical importance of oversight, accountability, and the voices of victims in preventing institutional abuse. What do you think about this horrifying chapter of medical history? The Whitmore twins operated with impunity for years because society couldn't imagine that nuns and medical professionals could be capable of such monstrous acts. Could similar horrors be happening today behind the closed doors of institutions we trust? If this story has affected you, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to understand that respectability and credentials don't guarantee virtue. Subscribe to this channel for more dark historical truths that challenge our assumptions about authority and trust. Leave a comment telling me what other buried secrets you want us to investigate. The past holds many more horrors that deserve to be remembered, if only to ensure they never happen again. Thank you for having the courage to face this difficult story with me. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous monsters often wear the most trusted faces.